HOA Karen tried to steal my mountain mansion and called the cops on me when I caught her. Turns out threatening a state judge with legal action isn't her brightest career move. If you've ever wanted to see a Karen try to evict a homeowner from his own property, smash that like button. And drop a comment if you think HOAs should require IQ tests for leadership positions, because after this story, you'll agree they desperately need them. My name's David, I'm 42, and I've been a state judge for the past 8 years. You'd think that job title alone would teach people not to mess with me, but apparently, some folks need a more hands-on education. I'd been living in the city for work, but after 6 months of back-to-back cases involving everything from domestic disputes to corporate fraud, I was about as burned out as a cheap light bulb. That's when I remembered my little sanctuary in the mountains, a beautiful log mansion I'd inherited from my grandfather 3 years ago. The place sits on 47 acres of pure wilderness, complete with a private lake, hiking trails, and most importantly, almost zero cell phone coverage. Paradise, in other words. I hadn't been up there since last Christmas, mainly because work had been consuming my soul like a particularly hungry demon. But last Friday, after listening to a lawyer argue that his client couldn't possibly have committed embezzlement because Mercury was in retrograde, I decided enough was enough. I needed mountains, fresh air, and the sweet sound of absolutely nothing. The drive up took about 3 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads until civilization became just a bad memory. I'd always loved this approach, watching the city fall away behind me like shedding an uncomfortable suit. The forest gets thicker, the air gets cleaner, and your blood pressure drops about 10 points per mile. But as I rounded the final curve toward my property, something felt off. For starters, there were lights on. Now, I'm not talking about the security lights I'd installed. Those were motion-activated and would flash on and off. These were warm, cozy, someone's definitely home kind of lights. The kind that suggested my mountain retreat had become someone else's full-time residence. My first thought was squatters. It happens more often than you'd think with vacation properties. Some desperate soul breaks in, figures the owner won't notice for months, and settles in like they're paying rent. Usually, they're harmless, just down on their luck and looking for shelter. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made my judicial instincts start twitching: a car in my driveway. Not just any car, but a pristine white BMW SUV with one of those obnoxious Karen 1 personalized plates. Because apparently, embracing the stereotype isn't embarrassing, it's a lifestyle choice. And there, like a cherry on top of this surreal Sunday, was a small sign planted in my front yard. Property of Pinecrest Mountain HOA. Authorized personnel only. Now, I know what you're thinking. David, didn't you check if your property was part of an HOA before you inherited it? And the answer is absolutely yes, it wasn't. My grandfather had specifically chosen this land because it was outside any HOA jurisdiction. He'd rather have eaten his own boots than deal with a bunch of suburban dictators telling him what color he could paint his mailbox. So either I was having the world's most specific hallucination, or someone had some serious explaining to do. I parked behind the BMW, effectively blocking it in, because I'm petty like that, and took a moment to appreciate the sheer audacity of the situation. Someone hadn't just broken into my house. They'd moved in, claimed it for an HOA that had no authority here, and apparently felt confident enough about their illegal occupation to put up signage. You have to admire that level of delusion. It takes real commitment to your own fantasy to redecorate someone else's reality. As I walked toward my front door, and yes, it felt weird having to specify that it was my front door, I could see movement through the windows. Someone was definitely home, probably wondering who had the nerve to park behind their BMW in their driveway. This was going to be interesting. I knocked on my own front door, which is definitely a sentence I never thought I'd have to write. The absurdity of the situation was almost entertaining, almost being the key word, since someone had clearly been treating my property like their personal vacation rental for months. The door swung open to reveal a woman who looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for entitled suburban mom. Blonde highlights that screamed expensive salon, yoga pants that cost more than most people's car payments, And that particular expression of outraged disbelief that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of authority usually reserved for small-town dictators. "This is private HOA property. You need to leave immediately." I blinked at her, genuinely wondering if she was having some kind of mental episode. "I'm sorry, what now?" "This property has been designated as the temporary residence for HOA administration while we conduct neighborhood improvements," she continued, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. "I'm Karen Whitfield, president of Pinecrest Mountain HOA, and you're trespassing." Let me just pause here to appreciate the sheer balls of this statement. This woman was standing in MY house, claiming I was trespassing on MY property, while representing an HOA that had exactly zero authority over MY land. It was like watching someone trying to arrest a police officer for impersonating themselves. "Interesting," I said, pulling out my phone to record this conversation, because honestly, who would believe this story without evidence? "And when exactly did this property become part of your HOA?" Her eyes narrowed. "All mountain properties within a 15-mile radius were incorporated 6 months ago for community safety and property value protection. If you have concerns, you can file a complaint with our board, but right now, you need to leave." 6 months ago. The exact amount of time I hadn't been here. What a coincidence. I see. "And who authorized this incorporation?" "The State Housing Authority," she said, chin raised like she'd just played a winning poker hand. "We have all the proper documentation. Now, here's where being a state judge comes in handy. I happen to know a thing or two about state housing authorities, mainly because I've ruled on dozens of cases involving them. And one thing I know for certain is that they can't just randomly incorporate private property into HOAs without the owner's knowledge or consent. It's not legal, it's not possible, and it's definitely not happening without a paper trail thicker than a phone book. But I decided to let her dig this hole a little deeper. Fascinating. I'd love to see this documentation. "I don't have to show you anything," she snapped. "You're trespassing, and if you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the police." "Please do," I said, settling into one of my own porch chairs. "I'll wait." The look she gave me could have curdled milk. Here she was, playing the role of righteous property defender, and I was refusing to follow her script. You could practically see the steam coming out of her ears as she pulled out her phone. 911. "Yes, I need police at 247 Mountain Ridge Road. There's a man here who's refusing to leave private property, and he's being very aggressive." Aggressive. I was sitting calmly in a chair, but apparently, failing to be intimidated by her fake authority made me aggressive. I made a mental note of that for the police report I'd definitely be filing later. While we waited for law enforcement to arrive and sort out this comedy of errors, Karen paced around my porch like she owned the place, which, in her delusional mind, she apparently did. She kept muttering things like, "People these days have no respect," and "wait until the board hears about this." The board. As if there was some shadowy council of mountain property conspirators backing her up in this elaborate real estate heist. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy pulled up the driveway. Poor guy probably thought he was responding to a routine trespassing call, not walking into the twilight zone of HOA overreach. Deputy Martinez, according to his name tag, was young, probably mid-20s, with that eager expression of someone who still believed most people were reasonable. He was about to get a crash course in Karen's psychology. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, looking between us like a substitute teacher trying to figure out which student started the food fight. Karen immediately launched into her prepared speech about trespassing and property rights and HOA authority, waving her hands around like she was conducting an invisible orchestra of outrage. I waited patiently for her to finish, then said, "Deputy Martinez, I'd like to report a breaking and entering. This woman has been illegally occupying my property for 6 months." The deputy's expression shifted from confusion to interest. "Your property?" "Yes," I said, pulling out my wallet to show him my driver's license with the property address. "This is my house." Karen's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of red that matched my grandmother's good china. Deputy Martinez looked at my license, then at Karen, then back at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle while blindfolded. You could practically see him thinking, "They don't pay me enough for this level of crazy." "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "do you have any documentation showing your authority to be on this property?" Karen's confidence faltered for exactly 3 seconds before she puffed up like an angry pufferfish. "Of course I do. This property was legally incorporated into our HOA district. I have the papers inside." "Great," I said, standing up from my chair. "Let's go inside my house and take a look at these fascinating documents." The emphasis on my house made Karen's eye twitch, which was honestly more satisfying than it should have been. We all trooped inside, and I had to give Karen credit for one thing. She'd made herself comfortable. My leather furniture had been rearranged. There were new throw pillows everywhere that screamed, "Live, laugh, love." And she'd somehow managed to make my rustic mountain retreat look like a suburban book club meeting space. But the real kicker was the kitchen. My grandfather's cast iron skillet, the one he'd used for 40 years, was nowhere to be seen, replaced by some modern nonstick nonsense. She'd reorganized my spice cabinet, thrown out my coffee, probably because it wasn't some organic, fair trade, blessed by amongst nonsense, and installed one of those ridiculous Keurig machines that make coffee taste like disappointment. "Nice decorating," I commented. "Very invasive." Karen ignored the jab and marched over to a folder on the kitchen counter, my kitchen counter, and pulled out a stack of papers with the theatrical flourish of a magician revealing their grand trick. "Here," she announced, shoving the documents at Deputy Martinez. "Official incorporation papers, signed and notarized." The deputy examined them while I waited patiently, because I already knew what he was going to find. When you've been a judge for 8 years, you develop a sixth sense for fraudulent paperwork, and Karen's official documents were setting off alarms like a smoke detector in a marshmallow factory. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said slowly, "these papers are interesting, but they don't actually show legal incorporation of this specific property. They appear to be general HOA formation documents for a different area entirely." Karen's face went through another spectacular color show. "That's impossible. I had them specially prepared by our lawyer." "And who might that be?" I asked, genuinely curious about what kind of legal professional would help someone commit what was essentially elaborate squatting. "Bradley Summers of Summers, Winters and Associates," she said proudly, like she was name-dropping royalty. I knew Bradley. Not personally, but professionally. I'd presided over 3 cases where he'd represented clients, and he was about as competent as a chocolate teapot. The kind of lawyer who'd probably help you sue yourself if you paid his retainer. "Ah, Bradley," I said. "Interesting choice. Tell me, when you hired him to draw up these incorporation papers, did you mention that you were planning to move into someone else's house?" "I am not squatting," Karen exploded, finally dropping her composed HOA President Act. "This property has been abandoned for months. Under state law, abandoned properties can be claimed for community benefit." And there it was, the real justification she'd constructed in her head. In Karen's world, my taking a break from my mountain house meant it was abandoned, and therefore up for grabs by any enterprising HOA dictator. Deputy Martinez looked like he was getting a headache. "Ma'am, abandoned has a very specific legal definition, and it doesn't mean the owner hasn't visited in a while." 6 months, Karen shrieked. 6 months with no activity, no maintenance, no presence. That qualifies. I pulled out my phone and showed the deputy my banking app. "Here are the automatic payments for electricity, water, property taxes, and security system monitoring. All current, all paid from my account, all documented. Hardly abandoned." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to process this devastating blow to her legal theory. But I've been maintaining the property," she sputtered. "Cleaning, organizing, making improvements. I've added value." "You mean you've been living rent-free in someone else's house and rearranging their furniture?" I corrected. "We have a word for that. It's called breaking and entering." Deputy Martinez nodded and reached for his handcuffs. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside while we sort this out." That's when Karen played her trump card. the one she'd probably been saving for just this moment. "You can't arrest me," she declared with the confidence of someone who'd clearly rehearsed this speech. "I know my rights. This is harassment, and when my lawyer hears about this, we'll sue for wrongful detention, property damage, and emotional distress." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. "And you? I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm going to make sure you're prosecuted to the full extent of the law. I have connections in the court system." I smiled. "Do you now?" "Absolutely. I'll have you dragged before a judge so fast it'll make your head spin. You picked the wrong woman to mess with." Deputy Martinez looked at me with something approaching sympathy. "Sir, do you want to press charges for unlawful occupation?" "Oh, absolutely," I said, still smiling at Karen. "But first, I think there's something Mrs. Whitfield should know about those court connections she mentioned." Karen stood there vibrating with righteous indignation, apparently convinced that threatening legal action was going to save her from the consequences of living in someone else's house for 6 months. It was like watching someone try to put out a fire with gasoline, enthusiastic, but ultimately self-destructive. "I'm going to own this property when I'm done with you," she declared, pointing at me like she was casting a spell. "My lawyer is going to tear you apart in court. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Deputy Martinez was writing in his notepad, probably documenting what would soon become the most entertaining police report of his career. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. Making threats isn't helping your situation." "These aren't threats, they're promises," Karen shot back. "I've dealt with troublemakers before, and I know exactly how to handle them. The judge in this district is going to laugh you out of court when he hears how you tried to steal HOA property." I had to admire her confidence. It takes real commitment to your delusion to threaten someone with legal consequences while you're literally standing in their illegally occupied house. "The judge in this district," I repeated thoughtfully. "Tell me more about this judge. You seem to know him well." Karen's chest puffed out with pride. "Judge Harrison retired last month, but the new judge is tough on property crimes and harassment. He's not going to tolerate this kind of behavior from troublemakers like you." "The new judge," I mused. "Interesting. And you're confident he'll side with you?" "Absolutely. I've researched his background extensively. He has a reputation for supporting community organizations and property rights. He'll see right through whatever sob story you're planning to tell." Deputy Martinez was watching this exchange with growing fascination, like someone observing a train wreck in slow motion. He'd probably figured out where this was heading, but Karen was so wrapped up in her own performance that she was missing all the signs. "Well," I said, reaching for my wallet again, "I hate to break up this fascinating legal analysis, but there's something you should probably see." I pulled out my judicial identification card and handed it to Karen. "Allow me to introduce myself properly. Judge David Coleman, State District Court. I was appointed to this district 6 weeks ago." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the mountain air itself holding its breath. Karen stared at the ID card like it was written in hieroglyphics, her mouth moving soundlessly as her brain tried to process what she was seeing. That's impossible," she whispered. "I assure you it's quite possible. I have the appointment paperwork, the swearing-in photos, and about 40 cases already on my docket to prove it." Karen's face went through its most spectacular color transformation yet, starting at pale white, progressing through green, and finally settling on a shade of red that suggested her blood pressure had just achieved orbit. You're the judge? The very one you were planning to drag your property dispute to?" I confirmed. "The one you're so confident will side with you in your lawsuit against the homeowner whose house you've been illegally occupying." Deputy Martinez cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I had no idea." "No need for formality, Deputy. We're not in court." I turned back to Karen, who looked like she was having an out-of-body experience. "Now, Mrs. Whitfield, you were saying something about how I'd be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." The transformation was remarkable. Karen went from raging HOA dictator to deflated balloon in about 3 seconds. All that bluster and confidence just evaporated. She stood there clutching my judicial ID like it was a snake that might bite her. I didn't know. This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered. "Oh, I think it's a very clear understanding, I said. You broke into my house, lived here for 6 months, claimed it was HOA property despite having no authority, called the police on the actual owner, and threatened to sue him. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a comprehensive crime spree. But I was told, my lawyer said, the incorporation papers are worthless, I finished. Mrs. Whitfield, in my 8 years on the bench, I've seen a lot of creative legal theories, but I can steal your house if you don't visit it enough is definitely a new one. Karen looked around my living room like she was seeing it for the first time, which, in a way, she was. For 6 months, she'd been living in her temporary HOA residence. Now she was standing in the home of the judge she'd just threatened to sue. Your Honor, she said weakly, perhaps we could discuss this reasonably. Oh, we're way past reasonable, I replied. Deputy Martinez, I'd like to press charges for breaking and entering, unlawful occupation, and theft of services. And I'll need Mrs. Whitfield to vacate the premises immediately. Of course, Your Honor. Ma'am, you need to gather your belongings and leave the property. Karen nodded frantically, clearly hoping that cooperation at this point might save her from complete disaster. She scurried around my house. Wow, it felt good to think of it as my house again, gathering her live, laugh, love decorations, and other suburban invasion supplies. But I wasn't quite done with her yet. After 6 months of turning my mountain retreat into her personal kingdom, Karen deserved a more memorable farewell. Oh, and Mrs. Whitfield, I called as she stuffed throw pillows into a garbage bag. You mentioned having connections in the court system? She looked up hopefully, like maybe this was her chance for redemption. Well, now you do. What followed was essentially the adult version of watching a toddler realize that the toy they've been playing with actually belongs to someone else. Except this toddler had been living in the toy for 6 months and had called the police to protect her from its rightful owner. Karen packed her belongings with the frantic energy of someone trying to outrun karma, though she was about 6 months too late for that. She kept glancing at me nervously, probably wondering if I was going to change my mind about letting her leave voluntarily instead of in handcuffs. Your Honor, Deputy Martinez said quietly while Karen stuffed her collection of decorative roosters into a box. What exactly happened here? How did she manage to occupy your property for so long? Simple, I replied, watching Karen struggle with my grandfather's old trunk that she'd apparently been using as a coffee table. I haven't been here since Christmas. She probably scouted out the property, realized it appeared empty, and decided to help herself. The fake HOA incorporation was just her way of making it seem official. But 6 months. The deputy shook his head. That's incredibly bold. That's one word for it. I'd probably use criminally stupid, but bold works too. Karen overheard this exchange and looked up from her packing. Your Honor, I really did believe the property was abandoned. My lawyer assured me that the incorporation was legal. Mrs. Whitfield, I said, settling into my reclaimed leather chair. Let me give you some free legal advice. When your lawyer tells you that you can move into someone else's house because they haven't visited in a while, that's your cue to find a new lawyer. She nodded miserably, like a student accepting criticism from a particularly stern teacher. Gone was the imperial HOA president who demanded I leave my own property. In her place stood a middle-aged woman realizing that her 6-month fantasy was about to become a very expensive nightmare. Will I have to appear in court? She asked hesitantly. I pretended to consider this. Well, that depends. Grand theft, breaking and entering, filing false documents, making fraudulent claims to law enforcement. I'd say court is definitely in your future. But you're the judge. Not for my own case, obviously. That would be a conflict of interest. No, you'll get to meet one of my colleagues. I'm sure they'll find your legal theory about abandoned property absolutely fascinating. Karen finished packing and stood by the door like she was waiting for permission to leave. The BMW keys jangled in her shaking hands, and I noticed she'd started crying at some point. Not the dramatic tears she'd probably used to manipulate HOA board meetings, but the quiet, desperate kind that comes with realizing you've made a catastrophic mistake. Mrs. Whitfield, I said as she reached for the door handle. Before you go, I'm curious about one thing. The HOA you claim to represent, does it actually exist? She looked like I'd asked her to explain quantum physics. Well, yes, sort of. Sort of. We had been discussing forming one for the mountain properties. There was interest from several homeowners about coordinating maintenance and security. But the paperwork, the official formation, never actually happened. I finished. She shook her head miserably. So you created an imaginary HOA, appointed yourself president of nothing, used fake documents to claim authority you didn't have, and moved into my house under the pretense of conducting official business that didn't exist. When you laid it out like that, it sounded even more insane than it already was. Deputy Martinez was writing furiously in his notepad, probably trying to capture every detail of what would become a legendary story at the sheriff's department. Your Honor, Karen said in a small voice, what happens now? I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked my property, not the Pinecrest Mountain HOA's fantasy jurisdiction. The evening sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in golden light. It was exactly the kind of peaceful scene I'd come here to enjoy, before discovering that my retreat had become someone else's headquarters. Now, I turned back to her. Now you leave my property, you contact a real lawyer, not Bradley Summers, and you prepare to face the consequences of 6 months of theft, fraud, and trespassing. Oh, and Mrs. Whitfield. Yes, Your Honor. You might want to work on your research skills. Next time you threaten to drag someone before a judge, make sure you're not talking to that judge. She nodded and fled to her BMW like the mountain was on fire. Deputy Martinez and I watched through the window as Karen's white SUV disappeared down the winding road, taking with it the most surreal afternoon of my judicial career. Your Honor, the deputy said, I have to ask, how are you going to handle this legally? I mean, prosecuting someone who threatened to sue you. I smiled, finally able to relax in my own home for the first time in months. That's the beauty of the justice system, Deputy. I don't have to handle it at all. Another judge will get the pleasure of explaining to Mrs. Whitfield why finders keepers isn't actually a valid legal principle for real estate acquisition. As the deputy left to file his report, I walked through my house, reclaiming my space. Karen had actually kept the place cleaner than I would have. I'll give her that. But she'd also rearranged everything according to her suburban sensibilities, turning my rustic retreat into something that belonged in a catalog called Mountain Living for people who've never seen mountains. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come here to escape the stress of city life and legal complications, only to discover that the law had literally moved in while I was away. But as I sat on my porch that evening, drinking coffee from my grandfather's old percolator, rescued from a box labeled outdated kitchen items, I had to admit that Karen had given me something valuable. The most entertaining story I'd tell at judicial conferences for the rest of my career. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Then I remembered that she'd thrown away my good coffee and replaced it with those awful pod things, and my sympathy evaporated like morning mist. Some people collect stamps. Others collect coins. Karen apparently collected felonies. And tomorrow, she'd get to start her very own collection of court dates. Thank you for being with us. Please share in the comments where you are watching from and whether you liked everything, and see you next time.